So I'd just like to welcome everyone to the History Now series. Today's session is Reverberating Through Time, the Archeology of the Queensland Native Police and Why It Matters Today. I'm Stephen Gapps, President of the History Council of New South Wales. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the Sydney region where the History Council of New South Wales is based. This conversation today is very much about Aboriginal history, and it's very important for historians, archaeologists and others who are working with Aboriginal people's stories to acknowledge the people who hold these stories and objects and knowledge. And to acknowledge their past custodianship of the land and waters we're on, wherever we may be today. And also just a warning that the discussion today may mention massacres and other events from the past that may be confronting to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Now, today's session, as I said, about the archaeology of Queensland's native mounted police and why it matters. Commencing just an overview, commencing in 2016, members of the Archeology of Native Mounted Police, or NMP, project have been exploring the controversial topic of violence on the Queensland frontier. Well, previous studies of the NMP have focused on policing activities as revealed by the historical record. This project has been combining archaeological, oral and historical evidence to understand more fully the activities and legacies of the force as they operated across Queensland during the second half of the 19th century. The project has been wide-ranging, working with Indigenous people and communities across the entire state, including descendants of massacre survivors, white officers and Indigenous troopers. The key focus of the research has been to make information broadly available to the public. So to this end, as we'll see, and I hope that our panel will talk about, will be the findings and the accessible database that these can be found. The research was funded through the Australian Research Council as a joint project by researchers from University of Notre, Flinders University, University of Southern Queensland, University of New England and James Cook University. Now today we have Heather Burke, Professor in the College of Humanities, Arts and Social Sciences at Flinders University. She's past co-editor of the Journal of Australian Archaeology, has published widely, including the books Meaning and Ideology in Historical Archaeology, and co-published the Archaeologist Field Handbook. Lynley Wallis is with us today. Maybe Lynley, you could wave, thank you. An Associate Professor in the Centre for Social and Cultural Research at Griffith University. Past co-editor of the Journal of Australian Archaeology and on the editorial board of Queensland Archaeological Research. Lynley has long-standing interest in the archaeology of Northern Australia, paleo environments and Aboriginal cultural heritage management. And Bryce Barker, and Bryce, give us a wave, is a professor in the School of Humanities and Communications at the University of Southern Queensland. He specialises in Australasian Indigenous archaeology, a field in which he's been working for more than 30 years. He's current editor of the Journal of Australian Archaeology and on the editorial board of Queensland Archaeological Research. So that's our panel. Thank you for joining us from South Australia and Queensland, Toowoomba and Adelaide, I think. To start, I think I'd like to go to Bryce, first of all, to start to give us a bit of an overview of how this complex project began.
Yeah, well, I guess, for the three of us, we were all very well aware of the extensive historical record relating to, frontier conflict, frontier violence, massacres, etc. But one of the things that we thought of archaeologists was, well, what would be the material signature of these events? It was probably only a matter of time before certain people would start asking the question, well, okay, you're saying you've got this historical record relating to massacres and frontier violence. What is the actual evidence for that? What is the material signature for that? Where are these sites where these events occurred? So one of the things that we thought that archaeology could bring to this was actually to identify some of these sites of frontier conflict. And when we were thinking about it, we realised that, and we asked the question, I suppose, what is the most likely material signature of frontier conflict that's still available, still there. In the Australian context, you know, massacres, the way that massacres occurred in the Australian context, they were unique in the Australian context in that they didn't occur in relation to usually or largely mass numbers of people being killed in one spot and then buried. The nature, like the Coniston massacre, was that NMP would ride through a camp, perhaps kill 2 or 3 or 4 people, then move on, and it might take place over a district for a period of weeks. So you're not going to find, well, it's going to be very difficult to find physical evidence of massacre sites in the Australian context. So one of the things we thought of was that, well, probably the most likely material remains for frontier conflict that still exists is probably the camps of the Queensland Native Mounted Police. And so we were already aware that a couple of these had been recorded in the Queensland state government site register. And Jonathan Richards in his book, of course, had also actually identified some. So what we did was we basically identify whether these sites exist, and if so, to what extent were they still maintained enough that they could be of value archaeologically. In other words, could we obtain information from the archaeological record from these camps? We eventually ended up, I think, recording nearly 700 NMP camps across Queensland. And these were camps that extended for a period of over 50 years across Queensland. So that was sort of the catalyst behind the project, but also the recognition that nearly all of the historical documentation, primary sources related to the white officers and basically the European side of things, and that there was no Indigenous voice at all really in any of this story or narrative. And so that was another key feature of our project, was to actually engage the Indigenous voice in terms of what happened to them and how they experienced frontier conflict and from the descendants.
Yeah, Bryce, it touches on a point that I've also been looking at too, and that's, I guess, what I might think of as a lack of attention and effort by archaeologists and historians in frontier war conflict in particular, to think that it's too hard to find that evidence. But you seem to have found a lot of evidence.
Yes. You know, the material signature of frontier conflict in Queensland is the Native Mounted Police camps. You know, I think the idea of actually going out and trying to find massacre sites, they do exist, no question about that. But because of the particular nature of how those massacres occurred in the Australian context, you're not going to find a massacre site like you might find, say, in Europe with the, you know, Polish officers who were massacred in the forest by the Russians, where, you know, you had 2,000 people packed in a size of a football ground. You're not going to get that kind of signature in the Australian context. So the obvious thing was, you know, these camps of the Native Mounted Police, and even though they were temporary, some of them were had to be maintained for over 20 years. So one of the ones we excavated up on Cape York, Baralga, for example, had to be maintained for long periods of time because of the degree of Aboriginal resistance to the stealing of their land.
Maybe, I'm not sure if you wanted to address this, Bryce, but if someone could give us a picture of whereabouts you're talking about across Queensland and what communities in general.
Yep, okay. So this is the part of the database that we've built, which is publicly accessible to everybody. At the moment, we've got a series of dots on there which are showing frontier conflict events that we have mapped. So we're mapping not just the massacres that Lyndall Ryan has talked about in her map, but also attacks where less than 6 people were killed, but also attacks on stock and attacks on property. And I can just turn all of those things off at the moment and show you where all the camps are. So you can see there now, these are all the camps that we've been able to identify across Queensland. And you can obviously see a distribution sort of, you get up into the Cape to the Palmer River and there's a much larger concentration of camps as opposed to out there in that Western country. So we've spent the last nearly 5 years literally travelling the length and breadth of the state and talking to hundreds of landowners, station managers, local Aboriginal communities about their knowledge about places in the landscape that we could go and visit and document. Heather, did you want to jump in?
I'll just say that probably the number of Native police camps is only about 150 because we spend a lot of time trying to work out, often camps are referred to in the historical record by different names, but it'll actually be the same camp. So we spend a lot of time reconciling all the different names, and we think reliably there's probably around 150 across Queensland. There could be a couple that
And when we say that, we've actually been out and ground truthed approximately 50 to 60 of those. Yeah. So we've physically gone out, found the site on the ground and said, yes, there are bullets here, or there's buildings here, or there's structures here. There's enough archaeological evidence for us to be happy that we've got the exact location. Some of the others will have already been destroyed and built over, such as the camp at Sandgate. In Brisbane itself, and a lot of the other ones are just too remote, or we just don't have enough information about where they were or where they are. So, another 3 or 4 years and another lot of money to do fieldwork, we could probably locate another 40 or 50, but there's just going to be maybe another 50 or 60 that we will never be able to find because they were either too short-lived or we really have lost their location forever. Or they've been destroyed. Yep.
And what kind of time period does that go from and to?
Pretty much from the first days of the Native Mounted Police, so 1849 is really when they first arrived in Queensland, which wasn't actually Queensland at the time. And the ending of the Native Mounted Police, there's no formal official end date. Most camps had fallen out of use or been explicitly shut down by about 1900, 1904, but the Cohen camp right up on Cape York did continue until about 1929. So that was really late. And of course, at that stage, it wasn't really called the Native Mounted Police. It had white police there as well, but it still was serving some of those similar sorts of functions. So really, a really long time period for this force to have been in operation.
And Bryce and yourself have touched on your methodology. I mean, it's an approach that incorporates history, archaeology, and memory. Maybe you could explore that a little bit more, Lynley, and what the importance of each element, I suppose, has been.
Well, I guess historians obviously are concentrating on the written documentation. And as historical archaeologists, that's an incredibly important part of what we do. But because we work a lot out on country with Aboriginal people, memory and oral history is incredibly important. And we're all very aware of the challenges of oral history. It often lacks the detail that might appear in a written record. So you might not have specific dates or specific years and specific names of people, but there can be an incredibly rich source of information in those oral histories passed down in not just Aboriginal families, but many of the white families, the pastoralists and stuff with whom we've worked. So we saw those oral histories as being an important source of potential information. And then, of course, the archaeological record as well. So we were trying to use the different sources with their strengths and weaknesses to sort of cross-correlate and test information from one source against the other. I don't know, Heather, if you wanted to jump in there.
In a lot of ways, this is very standard historical archaeology because a lot of these sites are just like any other site we'd go out and look for in the landscape. But the complexity of these sites, I think, really lies in the oral histories rather than the archaeology or the historical data, because there are so many sides to the story of the Native Police, and obviously there's the the people who were resident on that camp, the white officers and the troopers. There's the local people whose lives they took away or influenced in other ways. And then there's the descendants of all of those people. So for us, it's the oral histories that really reveal the complexity, the human story behind the objects. But if you looked at the archaeology, and we could probably show you some of the artifacts that we've catalogued, that's quite a different story again. That's quite an ordinary domestic story. And trying to put those things together, trying to put ordinary domestic artifacts together with the activities that we know the Native Police indulged in, like that was their job, and the social consequences of that for local people and for the descendants of officers and troopers has been the real sort of eye-opener for us, the real...
So what were some of the material objects that you found, and maybe some that were surprising, I suppose?
For me, there wasn't a lot that was surprising. You get the normal sort of domestic range. So you get all the things that people are eating and drinking, obviously. So you get lots of glass and lots of ceramic, so from plates and cups and like storage vessels. You get lots of metal because there's obviously lots of saddlery, lots of farrier activity, lots of sort of domestic maintenance of things going on in those camps. You get some faunal remains at some sites if we're lucky, but that was very rare and not very well preserved. You get lots of ammunition because obviously these people are well armed and they may be drilling at some of these campsites. So we get some discarded ammunition and some used ammunition. But really, if you just looked at that without knowing any of the history and without talking to anyone, you get a very ordinary domestic story. You'd be looking at rusty nails, rusty tin cans, broken glass, maybe some bullets, maybe some buttons if you're lucky.
I'm just going to jump in there. I noticed Tamsin has asked a question asking about our correlation and potentially of our findings with work from Raymond and Robert on camps and dispersals. And they were basing their figures on Jonathan's number of camps and being quite conservative. Because we've been able to identify a much larger number of camps than had Jonathan identified in his records, our number, if you use our number of camps and their same model for if, there were X number of camps and there were this many men in the camps and they had this many expeditions over the course of a year, and if they killed the same number of people, obviously because we've got more camps, we would suggest that the minimum number of Aboriginal people who lost their lives are actually quite substantially higher than Raymond and Robert's estimates. And we do have a paper coming out hopefully in the next 6 months where we actually unpack that a little bit more. So it's even more horrifying than what had been estimated previously.
Yeah, that was sorry, Bryce, that was going to be one of my questions. Lynley, you've been tweeting an event that occurs every day, and it seems to me that there is a killing almost every day in that historical period that you're looking at.
Yeah, absolutely. So those of you who are on Twitter, as Stephen says, I've been doing on this day, and every day I go in and look at our database and tweet about one of the events that happened on that day. And it's rare to go more than 3 days without there having been an event. And obviously in our database, we actually have more than 2,000 events now documented. And they are very heavily slanted towards killings of Europeans, and that's because of the nature of the primary sources. So after Mile Creek, Europeans realised that there was a potential for them to be punished if they were going out overtly killing Aboriginal people. So a lot of the killing of Aboriginal people became much more clandestine, and people didn't talk as openly about it. And of course, when a European was killed, there was absolute outrage, and people would write to the newspapers and the newspapers would report on it and things. So we get lots and lots of historical mentions of the Europeans who were killed, and not so many mentions of when Aboriginal people were killed. And we have tried to accommodate that in our database by saying, well, look, a lot of the deaths of Aboriginal people are recorded in the oral histories, but the very nature of our database, when we're trying to put a dot on a map, and assign it to a year has meant that we don't have a lot of information, specific information, to include those killings of Aboriginal people. But it is, and I guess the thing that you look at when you look at our database, and the map that I showed earlier was just how widespread violence was. But those big massacres, which Lyndall Ryan has been focusing on, where more than 6 people were killed, is the baseline definition that she used, is in almost every instance, those events are the culmination of sometimes months, at least weeks, usually, of smaller conflict that was going on before. So, you know, Aboriginal people would spear stock because they were hungry or they'd been kept out of water holes. Europeans would retaliate, and it would go into this, usually this cycle. So you'd have multiple events, which often then sort of escalated until you ended up with a very quite large scale killing in many instances.
Bryce, you wanted to say something here?
I was just going to go back to further what Heather was saying about the archaeology, in that one of the things that we actually uncovered with the archaeology, one of the sites at Baralga on Cape York, was we were able to locate the actual native mounted police, the Aboriginal quarters at Baralga. And when we excavated there, we've, you know, in the official records, of course, the troopers are very rarely mentioned. You know, nothing really about their personal lives or about how they lived. But when we excavated the troopers' huts at Baralga, we actually were able to piece together quite a lot about them as individuals and families. And for example, we got quite a lot of indigenous fauna. In other words, even though they were being supplied salted meat and rations, they were still hunting traditional foods. There was evidence that they were there with families, with children. We found children's toys. We found things like costume jewelry and perfume bottles, which, you know, again, sort of fleshed out how the Aboriginal troopers in this camp actually lived. And as Heather said, you know, it really just paints a picture of domesticity. You know, the saying, the banality of evil. And that's basically what these camps represent, is domestic scenes. And so the archaeology was actually able to sort of flesh out a little bit more about how the actual Aboriginal troopers lived, because they're just not really recorded in the historical record in the most cursory way.
And has that given you further insights into their motivations? That's one of the often talked about, you know, issues around the native mounted police.
Well, we actually published an extensive paper on this, and Heather, you might like to talk about this.
Up now. The archaeology doesn't really give you an insight into that. And we've tried as hard as we can to gather every sort of fragment from historical records to try and understand that, because it's the biggest question in our minds as well. Like, what would prompt young men, and sometimes very young men, to undertake this task? And some of them stayed in the native police for a long time, so they didn't all desert. Some of them were there for decades. Sometimes there were fathers and sons or brothers in the native police force, so you get more than one family member. And all of those men every day were dealing with the tasks that the NMP had to undertake. They were under various officers, some of whom were quite cruel. And trying to grasp that idea of what would either drive them or lure them to do that is one of the more complex questions we've asked. I don't know that we will ever come up with the answer or the only set of answers, because it would be as complex as that 80-year time period and all of the people involved in it and all of their motivations. I think you're probably fairly safe to argue that there were a limited range of choices for any of these men, and probably very limited for some of them, because if you think about it, all of them are coming from areas that have already had violence and been heavily settled already. So they're coming from an environment in which their families have been fragmented, their ways of life have been changed. Their whole cultural context has probably shifted markedly. And then they're going out and doing that to other people in new parts of the colony. I don't know how voluntary that would be on the part of a lot of those men, because the standard sort of European gloss, if you read the articles, the newspaper articles, whatever, people's casual comments are that these men were lured by the bright shininess of the uniforms or the pay. The pay was terrible. They often didn't get that pay anyway. But they wanted to wear the uniforms, they wanted to parade, they wanted guns. It's very difficult.
Sorry.
No, go on.
It also says, when you say these men, from what you've discovered, it's actually these men and their families in a lot of the cases, if those scenes of domesticity that your material record is bringing out, is it?
Yeah, it is. But again, those relationships, those familial relationships, are difficult to describe and comprehend as well, because a lot of the women that those men were marrying were taken from local tribes, local areas. How voluntary that was on the part of the women is a big question, and I would argue that for a lot of them it wasn't voluntary at all. Some men did bring their wives from Victoria, so some men had wives already that came with them into the NMP, but they were mostly those early troopers. For others, women were often given to them as a reward, and we know that from the documents, because there are occasions when Aboriginal men are censured for their behaviour, so they're not allowed access to their wives. So even though we say it's domesticity, domesticity is this peaceful, calm, sort of consensual word, and I don't know how true that is as a description of any of those camps or any of those families or any of those lives, and we'll never know that. We can never know.
The other thing I think that's been interesting in the research we've been doing is, although you may be looking at the screen now and seeing here are 3 white privileged academics, the project was very collaborative, and we had several Aboriginal partners who we were working with, some of us whom we have worked with for 20 or 30 years. We made a big effort to actually involve the local Aboriginal communities. And as the project went on and we went out and spent a lot more time on country in different areas, and people came to know us and trust us, it came out that a lot of people were descended from Aboriginal troopers. So within their own families, they had stories that had been handed down about their grandfathers or great-grandfathers and how they had come to be in the Native Mounted Police, and how they had kind of understood the actions that their great-grandfathers had been undertaking. And in a lot of those cases, the stories that were handed down were that their great-grandfathers were not openly willing participants in that, but their own families had been threatened, and that if they did not come along and join, they too would be killed. So that these are very raw, open stories, and they suggest that, yes, as the newspaper accounts will say, oh yes, we went and recruited 20 Aboriginal men, and they make it sound that it was a very willing process. The personal histories that are handed down suggest that it was often not very willing, and it was very much more coerced and forced labour.
And it's fair to say that there was a fairly high desertion rate as well amongst the troopers. So that's a telling statistic as well in this.
And offering recruitment as an alternative to jail. So, that's your choice. Go to jail, join the Native Police.
And some were taken as children and actually brought up in camps. And so, there's a whole range of motives, I suppose, for why people joined the NMP.
It might be worth, I see Nancy's asked a question about undertaking traditional practices still. And it's quite interesting, that question of assimilation or civilisation of Aboriginal people who may have joined the force. certainly from the archaeological evidence that we've got, even though the organic preservation isn't brilliant, there are lots of indications that Aboriginal people were still maintaining quite a lot of cultural practices. We certainly know that although they were given rations, it appears the rations were never really enough to live on, particularly for the women in the camps. They were only ever given half rations compared to what the men were given, and there's very little indication that the children were really given rations. So it appears that for Aboriginal people, they really had to supplement their diet with traditional foods, which meant they would have maintained that those food collecting practices. Certainly we have, you know, as Heather said, we do have some faunal remains of native animals. We have shellfish that suggest people were still doing that. We have scarred trees on some of the sites, which suggests that people were still getting sugar bag and possums and things like that. And the other thing that's really obvious is the napping of glass bottles. So Aboriginal people would traditionally have napped stone artefacts, and the bottles were there, and they were a fantastic source of raw material. And so even though troopers and their wives often had access to things like metal knives and axes and things, they were actually maintaining this cultural tradition of napping. And you know, some of that may have been functional, and there are indications that troopers did not always have access to their own weaponry. So in some instances, their weapons, when they weren't on patrol, were actually locked up and not available to them. But if they needed to hunt for food, in some instances, they would have still hunted with traditional weapons that they had made. And in some instances, they may have been allowed access to their guns to go and kill a kangaroo or something. But there's certainly indications that people were maintaining those sorts of traditions. Obviously, people were still speaking in language. I guess one of the main differences in terms of maintaining tradition is that because troopers were not generally patrolling in their own country where they came from, they did not have access to country where they knew the stories, and they could visit their own ceremonial sites or their own special places and things like that. So that aspect of knowledge of country, they were in a foreign country. So that ceremonial aspect of Aboriginal life, I suspect, was quite different for the Aboriginal troopers, simply because they weren't on their own country. But I think the evidence suggests they were maintaining a lot of tradition and adapting to the new resources and situation they found themselves in.
And I guess related to that question is, do you think, did you get any sense of the opposite, that there was not so much assimilation, but opportunity and success for people in men and families joining the NMP?
In terms of the Aboriginal men, I think there were certainly Aboriginal men who became very well educated and who were serving some of the officers and had very close personal relationships. Some Aboriginal men after the force did go on and have other jobs, which were quite, reasonable jobs and earned quite a lot of money. There was one man in particular who left quite a large sum of money in his will, which of course never went to his wife or his children. It was contested, because how dare an Aboriginal man have these sorts of resources? In terms of, I guess, Europeans, it's a bit of a different story about what happens after. I don't know, Heather, do you want to?
Well, it's that complexity of trying to deal with the entire NMP across 80 years again. And there's the full range. So there are people who go on to become Commissioner of Police, for example, and there are other officers who die destitute, like they die in the destitute asylum, or they go bankrupt, often more than once. So you get the full range. You get some that go into property speculation afterwards, so they make their money in other ways. You get some who die with enormous estates. So some obviously made a lot of money, but there's no one answer to that.
I mean, conditions were very hard being an NMP officer. Obviously, quite often they were the only white person in very isolated environments. Quite often they might have a white sergeant with them, but otherwise, they couldn't properly communicate with the Aboriginal troopers. So the isolation for some of these people led to all sorts of health issues, alcoholism, alcohol abuse, these kinds of things. So, quite a lot of them died relatively young because of the sort of harsh conditions that they were working and living in. But alcohol was definitely, an issue for the officers of the NMP. You could get accounts of misconduct relating to alcohol quite regularly in official reports.
I see. I'm curious to ask a question about the alcohol consumption, and Bryce has specifically been looking at that very issue. So, yeah, I mean, we get a huge amount of glass bottles and glass fragments on the site. So, Bryce, would you like to talk to that question about alcohol consumption?
Well, it's very hard to quantify exactly from the bottles that we get in the archaeology, and it's very hard to know, what constituted excess alcohol intake in the middle of the 19th century. I think, when we look at alcoholism and alcohol abuse, it's probably a very different story today. And we know from official records that being an alcoholic as an officer was not necessarily an impediment to continuing in your role. So as long as you were able to maintain the records, etc., that were required, they would turn a blind eye to the fact that you were drinking yourself stupid. And we've got a couple of records that really ram home that point that, look, yeah, he's an alcoholic, but he's a good man, and we're going to keep him. So it's very difficult to quantify alcohol consumption. Most of the glass we get are sort of generic wine bottles, or what they call champagne bottles. But whether, a lot of the bottles were reused and refilled with, so you might get a wine bottle that's actually refilled with beer. So you don't really know exactly what people were drinking out of those bottles. And it's just very difficult to quantify. But, when we combine the archaeological record, the amounts of alcohol, I mean, all the glass we get, the far majority of it are alcohol-related bottles. And we combine that with the historical record, we can assume that, these people were hitting the alcohol fairly hard. And it's interesting, there's very little record about whether the native police themselves were allowed access to alcohol. We assume not, well, not officially anyway. But yeah, it's a very difficult thing to quantify how much alcohol was consumed.
And Bryce, maybe you could follow on, or someone else, but Tamsin's asked a question related to that theme. Is there any evidence of alternative unauthorised economies emerging around the camps?
Not that I know of. I don't think that, we've got very much information on that kind of thing at all. Heather, would you like to know? I think so.
Yeah, there's no evidence of that so far, but we also haven't finished analysing all of the material.
Yeah.
It is quite interesting, this idea that all of the troopers were supposedly being paid, although it wasn't a lot of money. And yet on all the excavations, out of the tens of thousands of artefacts we have recovered off sites, we've never found a single coin of any sort. And usually you get low denomination coins being dropped all the time. So that in itself is kind of interesting. One thing we do get enormous amounts of on the sites are buttons, all sorts of buttons. And it's possible sometimes they may have been used as gaming tokens potentially, but just the quantities of buttons in some areas and some sites are really far more than what you might have expected, I think. So, but yeah, there must have been all sorts of barter and trade going on. And we certainly know that, people were having interactions with local pastoralists as well. So there must have been stuff going on there. I suspect in terms of barter and trade, like we know that Aboriginal women were often treated in that way as sort of chattels, and as Heather had said, were being used, handed around sort of as a reward for good behaviour, or being access to women was being restricted for as punishment for bad behaviour. And there certainly seems to have been relationships with some of the pastoralists in terms of the supply of rations and the supply of labour force and stuff, which almost undoubtedly extended to the Aboriginal women, who were the particular ones who were in the camps not willingly. I think one of the interesting things that's come out sort of with our database as well, so our database has been about documenting everything that we could find. So there have been all these researchers working in this area for a long time, and you know, everyone sort of has to go to the archives themselves and access the material, which of course, if you're not Brisbane based, becomes very hard. So one of the things we explicitly set out to do was to try and make that material more openly accessible and available to everyone. So we've tried to digitise all of the archive records that we've come across, we've transcribed them, we've cross-referenced them, and in doing that, we've figured out that there were more than 400 white officers during the history of the force. There were more than 800 Aboriginal troopers, we think about, through the history of the force. And the other thing that we also documented were the associated individuals. So these were non-staff members of the Native Mounted Police, but who were connected in some way. So these might have been judges, they might have been non-Native Mounted Police officers, they might have been the pastoralists, they might have been victims of assault or injury. And the thing that really shows is the same people's names keep coming up over and over and over again, and it really brings home just how small the European population was in Queensland through the late 19th century. It's the same people who own the land who then go out and expand. It's the same people whose stockmen are being attacked, whose stock are being attacked, who are then, you know, the legislators and the politicians who are making laws about this, who are making decisions about how to fund the Native Mounted Police. And so it's sort of, I guess, one degree of separation between all those people, which I found was really interesting sort of in the history, and that if you yourself had not had a family member who was involved directly in frontier violence in that time, you certainly knew somebody who had. You know, it was a very, very small community. So everybody in the state at the time knew what was going on, and obviously most of them were, I guess, giving their tacit approval. There were not that many people speaking up about it, because to do so was to really put yourself at social and economic risk, because most people were maintaining the status quo.
Mm. There's a couple of other questions come up, maybe we can get to them in a minute. I just wanted to ask a couple of more things. My interest is very much about resistance warfare, and I just wondered if, from your work so far, you've had some thoughts, changed your mind, or have some ideas on the complexity, I suppose, of some of the evidence being more about policing methods as opposed to resistance warfare, how that frontier violence is mixed between police and resistance. If you had any thoughts on how that might have changed over the last few years in your minds?
Well, I think the number of Native Mounted Police camps and the range of years that they had to be maintained speaks for itself in terms of the degree of Aboriginal resistance to the theft of their land, especially on Cape York, where we've got a high density of NMP camps, some of which had to be maintained for long periods of time. And we have records of where they'll say, look, we want to move the camp, we want you to move the camp to somewhere else. And then there'll be a barrage of letters to the Colonial Secretary saying, no, you can't do that because the natives are still active. So, you know, the extent and the longevity of these camps is testimony to the degree of resistance that they had to be maintained in order for European settlers to actually maintain their presence in these remote places. So even though we mightn't find, you know, massacre concentrations of massacre sites, etc., or even necessarily detailed accounts of conflict, those factors are a testimony in themselves.
And I guess, sorry, go on.
I was just going to respond to sort of Kira's comment there about Indigenous agency and the Native Police and that story in the Gippsland. And I think the thing that's a little bit different in Queensland is that the distances that are involved are quite, we're obviously dealing with a much larger area than Victoria and also with New South Wales. And there was this very explicit process of recruiting from quite a long way away. So many of the troopers were operating in areas that were 500 to 1,000 kilometres away from where their own country was. So I don't think that idea that they may have joined up to retaliate against their own local potential enemies, I don't think that was at play here, because they were never going to be operating close by most of the groups that they would have been, whose country they would have been operating in, they would have had no direct connections to. Obviously, there's song lines and ceremonial practices that go across the country, but they wouldn't really have ever been into open conflict with those groups in the past.
But also, in saying that, the people that they were dealing with were strangers to them,
yes,
outsiders. So they would have all been classified as outsiders in the same way that white people would be. So you probably are, they were deliberately constructing a situation in which Aboriginal people would have no loyalties to local people. And if those local people are just classified as outsiders in the same way, then perhaps their resistance to violence against them is non-existent or negligible. Yeah. So maybe that is part of how you can maintain that system and make it function.
Nancy has a question there about, is there any evidence of connection with local people in their ceremonies through women? It seems this could create divided loyalties.
Yeah, there's a few interesting things there around ceremony that have come out while we've been doing the project. At least 2 and probably 3 of the Native Mounted Police camps that we've ground truthed are actually on waterholes which have traditional Aboriginal stone arrangements on those waterholes. So that would traditionally have been places of ceremony, and then the Native Mounted Police have come up and set their camps on that location. And one of the things that's really interesting when you look at the distribution of artefacts on those sites is that there can be tens of thousands of artefacts everywhere, but where the stone arrangements are, there is not a skerrick of material. So obviously the Aboriginal troopers who were there, even though it wasn't their country, they knew very clearly what those stone arrangements were and that it was not a good place for them to be there. And it looks like they told the white officers also, don't go near that stone arrangement, like bad things are going to happen. So there's that element of ceremony that was going on. There are several accounts of some of the officers who had that interest in natural history and who became experts on Aboriginal custom and culture. They describe Bora ceremonies. So they took their detachments and they actually spied on Bora ceremonies while they were happening, and then wrote descriptions of those ceremonies that were then published. So they certainly, and at least one of the police camps was located. The map that shows the location of the police camp in the landscape specifically describes where the Bora grounds were and where the travel routes were. So there was an understanding of the ceremonial practice that was going on, and the police were in some ways tapping into that. It seems that the women who were taken from those camps taken from after massacres that had happened or who were stolen and who ended up in the police camps generally didn't seem to really maintain any relationship with their original group of people. There was once, it seemed to be that if you were a woman and you had gone and been taken by the Native Mounted Police, there were indications that potentially it wouldn't be safe for that woman to go back to her tribe. So there are some indications, although because white officers were writing about them, it's hard to know how biased those opinions are. And there is an interesting ceremony out in Western Queensland where there is some indication that that ceremony, that the dance and songs that went on were actually adapted to include elements about the Native Mounted Police, which is really interesting, which is something we are hoping to get some funding to actually maybe look at over the next 3 years.
And there's also the case at Wondigumble where such bad discipline was so lax that when the sub-inspector goes to inspect the camp, all the Aboriginal troopers are off having local ceremony with the locals. So it did happen sometimes, but it wasn't routine and it wouldn't have been normalised.
Yeah, and I think that particular case was Wondigumble was a particularly bad instance. That was only the second camp that was established in Queensland, and it went through a fairly bad period with some very poor quality officers involved.
Yeah. And alcohol played a part in that at Wondigumble, for sure.
Yeah.
Just something that you all touched on earlier was working with communities on all the different camp locations. And I just wondered if you could give us a sense of how communities had accepted what is, or how they'd worked with you in what is a really confronting project.
There are, as we said, some of the people we've worked with, we've had relationships for 10, 20, 30 years. Almost every Aboriginal person we met was very willing to talk about. I mean, this is their history. It's not something they hide. It's not something that they don't want to talk about. They want this stuff talked about. So as confronting as it was, they were just very happy that people wanted to talk about it, and it gave them an opportunity to be back on country. There were some places that it was really difficult for them to go. So at least one of the camps up at Puckley's on Cape York, it was on the top of a hill, and at the bottom of the hill was a waterhole, and that waterhole was said to have been the scene of several massacres of these people's ancestors. So it was really emotional for them going back out on country with us, and we and them never actually went down to the waterhole because there was so much emotion associated with that. In some instances, there were a lot of tears out on country, with people getting very emotional telling some of those stories. But they weren't so much tears of anger, but they were tears of relief that there was a chance to talk about this, I think, and that there was I guess it's that thing about reconciliation and, the Uluru Statement, we need some truth telling to go on to be able to move past this or move forward in a positive way together. And so I think for a lot of the people we work with, this project did give them that opportunity to do that.
One of the really important things for this project is to tell the story to a wider audience, to make this mainstream history. And, the idea of the database, having all that information accessible to the general public. Our goal is to try and make this as commonly known and as widespread and accessible as possible, because, there's a lot of denial, as we know, that goes on in regards to this history, because it doesn't tell a narrative, the sort of settler narrative that's the dominant one. So it's been a major goal as well to as widely disseminate this project and the information we got from it as we possibly can.
And could you give us a quick overview of where people can find that information? I know you've got a wonderful series of blogs.
Yep. So I might just share the screen with people now. So here we go. So if you go to frontierconflict.org, you'll be able to access our database in there, and you can see there's various ways you can get into it. You can click into the events, which will then throw you into maps, and you'll be able to click on particular events that happened and see what happened. You can also search for anything. So you see I've typed down here Hornet Bank. If you search for Hornet Bank, again, it will throw you into the actual database, and it will bring up events that have the words Hornet Bank associated with them, Aboriginal people who are associated, blog posts, all sorts of things there. So that frontierconflict.org URL is worth going to, and also the other one that's worth having a look at our blog is the Archeology on the Frontier blog, which I'm hoping you can now see. You can now see the Archeology on the Frontier blog there as well. So that will show you we're not posting so regularly anymore, but we do post. We have posted a lot over the last few years on a whole bunch of different topics, and all of the publications that have come out from our project are also available for people there. But the idea is that, people can see all the primary sources that we've used for themselves, and we're also putting up all the archaeological information, so you can go and look at the artifacts that we found and see things like the buttons and the scarred trees and the lithics and the glass and all. So all of that information is being made available openly, that look at the primary sources themselves, and look as well for places where they might have grown up. You can go and search for banana and see what events were happening around banana. You can search for names of families or properties. So it's a really great resource, and we're finding that school teachers in particular, for the Year 11 and Year 12 history curriculum, are quite often using it as a resource to get their students to do focused studies. And certainly through that process, we've actually had quite a lot of descendants of people who have popped out of the woodwork and said, I came across your blog or your website, and actually I'm a descendant of officer such and such, or of this person who was in the force. So that's been really useful, sort of building those networks.
It's worthwhile mentioning too that, as Lynley said, we've had a number of descendants of the white officers get in touch, and when we did this project, it relied on us actually getting access to these sites, which are usually on large properties. Sometimes the descendants of the original settlers still there, and by and large, there was the odd exception. The response from landholders was overwhelmingly positive about our project, and we did sort of signal that it might potentially have been a problem at the beginning about getting access to some of these sites, but in actual fact, overwhelmingly, landowners were more than happy to accommodate us and include the traditional Aboriginal owners come onto the properties. So it's been overall pretty positive in that regard.
And in almost every instance, those landowners came out on the sites with us, and they brought their kids out, and we had them going around sticking pin flags in the ground and using the total station and recording stuff with us. So it was a really great sort of hands-on exercise in bringing people together.
That's a great note to finish on. Thanks so much, Lynley, Bryce, Heather. Thank you for coming into the History Now series, which has been thrown into some disarray this year, but there will be more History Now seminars coming up in the later part of this year. So thanks very much, everyone.